wasn't a protest. It wasn't a press conference. It was a move so quiet most people didn't even notice until the dealerships emptied out. Toyota, Honda, and Mazda didn't fire back with threats. They simply walked away. Away from overpriced tariffs, away from political games, and straight into the arms of Southeast Asia and the electric future. While American automakers scrambled to catch up, Japan rewrote the rules: cheaper labor, faster innovation, better strategy. In one move, they didn't just dodge the punch, they made the US auto industry punch itself. And now, the silence is louder than ever. The tariff that missed its mark. On April 3, 2020, the United States made a bold move. It slapped a 25% tariff on all vehicles imported from Mexico and Canada. The goal? Hit back at foreign competitors and strengthen domestic auto manufacturing. But it didn't go as planned. While aiming to shake China and Europe, the move ended up hitting close allies, especially Japan. Automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Mazda had long relied on Mexico and Canada for US exports. This tariff wasn't just economic policy, it was a blind punch in a crowded room. For years, Japanese car makers had built a strong production system across North America. Their factories in Mexico and Canada didn't just assemble cars, they were deeply tied into a massive supply chain. Parts crossed borders multiple times before reaching the final assembly line. This system had worked like clockwork until April 3rd. Overnight, shipping routes were blocked by rising costs. Factories had to slow down. What was once a seamless operation turned into a logistical nightmare. The reaction from Japan? Silence, at least in public. There was no shouting on TV, no angry press conferences. Instead, the companies started to shift behind the scenes. Production plans were quietly reworked. Boardrooms in Tokyo lit up late into the night with strategy meetings. This wasn't surrender, it was recalibration. The move from Washington had forced their hand, but it hadn't broken their spirit. As one industry analyst put it, the US aimed at rivals but hit its allies. And the allies didn't fight back with noise. They responded with strategy. But while Japan stayed quiet, the real story was just beginning to unfold. Because when the production lines paused in North America, the ripple effects started to hit American soil hard. As Japan adjusted its global strategy, the silence wasn't just about staying calm, it was part of a bigger play. One that would slowly shift the entire balance of the global auto industry. The next move wasn't made in the headlines, it was made in the background. Strategic silence. In the days following the tariff, there was no retaliation from Japan, no threats, no speeches. But that didn't mean nothing was happening. Japanese automakers had long prepared for scenarios like this. Years of quiet planning came to life. They started moving production out of North America and into Southeast Asia. Countries like Thailand and Vietnam became the new focus. These nations offered cheaper labor, trade-friendly agreements, and fewer political surprises. The shift wasn't just reactive, it was smart. Moving factories isn't easy, but Japan had an edge. Their production systems were flexible and modular. In places like Vietnam, land deals were signed. In Thailand, factory expansions were fast-tracked. What had taken decades in North America was happening in just months in Southeast Asia. This wasn't about abandoning the US, it was about spreading risk. Japanese companies were making sure that no single market could ever hold them hostage again. At the same time, another plan was kicking into gear. Japanese automakers used this opportunity to go all in on electric vehicles. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan ramped up their investment in EV technology. They poured resources into battery research and started reshaping their fleets for a cleaner future. It wasn't just about adapting, it was about taking the lead in the next big shift in auto. As a trade expert noted, Japan didn't need to threaten. They had been preparing for this moment for years. They didn't retaliate with noise, they responded with evolution. And while Southeast Asia became their new production hub, innovation became their weapon. While others argued about tariffs, Japan was already stepping into the future. But while Japan was busy building a future-proof strategy, the impact of their withdrawal began to show where it hurt the most, in the US dealerships. Fewer cars were coming in, and American customers were about to feel it. The ripple effect on US dealerships. American dealerships felt the shift faster than anyone expected. Popular Japanese models, once easy to get, started arriving in fewer numbers. Orders were delayed, showroom lots looked emptier. For brands like Toyota, Honda, and Mazda, usually top sellers in the US, this was a problem. But it was an even bigger problem for the dealerships that depended on those cars to stay afloat. With fewer cars available, prices started to climb. The law of supply and demand kicked in fast. Dealerships raised sticker prices, and buyers had to stretch their budgets. In some cases, buyers gave up altogether. Affordability dropped. People who had always trusted Japanese vehicles were now stuck with two tough choices: pay more or wait longer. But surprisingly, trust in Japanese brands didn't vanish. Despite higher prices and longer waits, many Americans stayed loyal. These cars had earned a reputation for reliability. For decades, they delivered value and durability. That kind of trust doesn't break overnight. Buyers still came back, even if it meant sacrificing time or money. As one industry report put it, even with tariffs, Japanese automakers absorbed costs and kept their market share above 35%. That resilience says a lot. Japanese car makers didn't abandon the US. They just adapted. But the cracks were starting to show, because for every car that didn't arrive, another sale was lost. And in an industry built on volume, even small disruptions can turn into major consequences. And as customers adjusted and prices climbed, the spotlight shifted to where Japan was now placing its bets: Southeast Asia. A new auto empire was quietly forming, far from the noise of Washington. Southeast Asia. While North America struggled with policy chaos, something quieter but just as powerful was happening across the Pacific. Japanese automakers were planting new roots in Southeast Asia. Countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia weren't just backup plans. They were the future. With lower labor costs, supportive governments, and easier trade terms, Southeast Asia offered Japanese car makers the perfect escape route and a new engine for growth. Toyota expanded its manufacturing footprint in Thailand. Honda doubled down in Vietnam. Mazda eyed Indonesia for long-term assembly hubs. These moves weren't just about cutting costs. They were about building resilience. Southeast Asia provided a level of flexibility and cooperation that the US was no longer offering. And Japanese companies, known for their precision and long-term vision, weren't about to wait around for US policy to change again. What made these transitions smoother was how closely Japanese firms worked with local partners. Governments in the region were eager to welcome investment, land, labor, tax incentives. Everything moved quickly. And local suppliers began integrating into the supply chain at record speed. It wasn't just about opening factories. It was about creating entire ecosystems of innovation and efficiency. As one global trade analyst observed, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, these were the new chess pieces. And Japan wasn't just playing the game, they were quietly winning. With their bets placed across Asia, Japanese automakers had rebalanced their power and opened new doors. But while Southeast Asia was rising, American consumers were left wondering, why are their favorite cars suddenly so far away? And as Japan secured its future in Southeast Asia, its vision turned even sharper, toward the next big leap in auto innovation: electric vehicles. What started as a response to tariffs had now become a race to shape the future of transportation. EV innovation. While the world focused on where cars were built, Japan focused on what kind of cars would rule the roads next. The answer was clear: electric vehicles. But Japan wasn't chasing the EV trend, it was leading it. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan poured billions into solid-state batteries and hybrid systems. They weren't just looking for speed, they were aiming for the perfect balance: cleaner, longer-lasting, smarter cars. Japan's EV strategy wasn't just about building electric cars faster, it was about doing it better. Solid-state battery tech offered safer, more efficient energy storage. Hybrid vehicles gave customers an easier bridge into the electric future. While other nations rushed to copy Tesla, Japan focused on reliability, sustainability, and engineering finesse. This shift wasn't only about technology, it was also about survival. Tariffs made traditional exports tougher. Fuel prices were climbing. Global climate targets were tightening. Japanese companies knew the old way wouldn't work forever. So they built new systems that could weather both economic pressure and environmental demands. EVs weren't just the future, they were the insurance policy. As one senior executive put it, this wasn't retaliation, it was evolution. Japan's quiet move into EV innovation didn't just dodge trade wars, it redefined the battlefield. And while their factories kept running, their R&D labs were quietly rewriting the rules of the auto industry. But while Japan sprinted into the future, the US auto industry found itself stuck in the past. As dealerships faced shortages and Japanese companies adapted, American automakers were about to face a harsh reality. Their biggest competitors had changed the game, and they were still playing catch-up. The US auto industry's missed opportunity. Back in the US, the story was very different. As Japanese companies expanded in Asia and innovated in EVs, American automakers were struggling to fill the growing gap. The tariffs were supposed to help domestic brands, but instead of stepping up, many fell short. They didn't have enough small, fuel-efficient vehicles ready, and their EV development was years behind the curve. For years, US companies had doubled down on SUVs and trucks, big, powerful, profitable machines. But when gas prices surged and imports dropped, consumers started looking for efficient alternatives. And that's where Japanese brands used to shine. Now, with those models harder to find, customers were left frustrated. Meanwhile, American automakers were still trying to pivot, a pivot that came too late. The problem wasn't just about the product, it was about priorities. While Japan had spent a decade preparing for a shift in global demand, many US firms were caught flat-footed. They had the resources, they had the history, but they lacked the urgency, and that hesitation came at a cost. Market share, consumer trust, and a growing sense that the country's auto industry was falling behind. As one automotive journalist put it, "We tried to flex. Japan flexed back with battery patents, production logistics, and strategic silence. And in that silence, there was something powerful. A masterclass in long-term thinking. While the US focused on short-term wins, Japan played for the next decade, and they were already on the move. And while American brands scrambled to regroup, Japan was already looking ahead. But the financial toll of the tariff wasn't over yet, because even with innovation and relocation, the numbers were starting to show, and the costs were stacking up fast. Financial implications for Japanese automakers. The strategic moves made by Japanese automakers helped them dodge the worst of the storm, but not all of it. The tariffs hit hard financially. For Japan's 5 biggest car makers, the estimated cost of the US tariffs reached a jaw-dropping $25 billion per year. That's not just a dent, that's a major hit to profits, investments, and planning. Even the strongest global brands felt the pressure in their balance sheets. To stay afloat, companies had to adapt fast. This wasn't just about moving factories anymore. It was about reshaping entire business models. Automakers began trimming operations, pausing less profitable projects, and streamlining their supply chains to cut costs. Every part, every shipment, every labor hour was reevaluated. Efficiency became the new currency. The goal? Survive the tariffs without losing their competitive edge. But what saved many of these companies from a complete collapse was diversification. Instead of betting everything on the US, Japanese firms turned toward other markets. Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America offered new demand, fresh consumers, and fewer trade headaches. Sales that were once concentrated in North America started spreading globally. It didn't erase the loss, but it helped soften the blow. As Takaki Nakanishi, a top analyst in Tokyo, put it, "The amount will inevitably deal a blow to the Japanese economy." And it did, but it didn't cripple it. These companies were bruised, but they were still standing. And now they were leaner, sharper, and even more determined to never be caught off guard again. But while the money flowed out of corporate accounts, the political fallout was just beginning. Tariffs don't only hit balance sheets, they ripple through boardrooms, backrooms, and even diplomatic circles. What started as an economic move was quickly becoming a political storm. political ramifications, and diplomatic strains. Behind the scenes, the reaction from Japan's government was quietly tense. They didn't explode on the global stage. Instead, leaders expressed deep disappointment and began working diplomatic channels. There was no interest in a trade war, but neither was there acceptance. The tariff move forced Japan to rethink not just its trade strategy, but its relationship with one of its oldest allies. Tokyo reached out to Washington, pushing for dialogue and a path to de-escalation. Officials asked for explanations. They held meetings, made phone calls, and appealed to shared history. But with elections looming in the U.S., political posturing got in the way of practical diplomacy. Trade talks dragged on, and trust began to erode. The alliance, once strong, now felt unstable. Inside Japan, policymakers began discussing bigger questions. Could they rely on the U.S. in the long term? What other partnerships should they strengthen? Economic ties with the EU and ASEAN nations started looking more appealing. The message was clear. Japan would never again depend too heavily on one nation, even a trusted partner. It was time to diversify, politically and economically. As Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said at a press conference, "We must consider steps to respond appropriately. We have all possible options on the table." And while his tone was calm, the meaning was firm. Japan was moving from cooperation to caution. The auto tariffs didn't just disrupt trade, they forced a deep reevaluation of how global alliances work in an era of uncertainty. Meanwhile, while leaders debated behind closed doors, regular consumers were making decisions of their own. Showroom by showroom, street by street, American car buyers were responding and reshaping the market in ways no one had planned for. Consumer behavior and market shifts. Out on the streets, the real test was unfolding. American buyers weren't just watching the headlines, they were reacting with their wallets. For years, Japanese cars had built a reputation that no tariff could erase. So even with higher prices and limited supply, many consumers stuck with what they trusted. Toyota, Honda, Mazda, these weren't just cars. They were known for lasting longer, running smoother, and costing less to maintain. But price still mattered. With markups rising, some buyers started looking elsewhere. Korean brands like Hyundai and Kia saw an opportunity and jumped in with competitive prices and impressive warranties. Domestic makers pushed hard too, offering incentives and financing deals. Some customers made the switch, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. For many, it became a matter of what they could afford. And then came the rise of the used car market. With new Japanese models harder to get, demand for used ones soared. Dealers couldn't keep them on the lot. Older Civics, Corollas, and Accords, once average secondhand buys, suddenly became hot property. People who couldn't get new cars started holding onto their old ones longer. Repairs went up, so did the prices of parts. The ripple effect touched everything. As one auto market observer noted, American consumers are still buying Japanese cars, only now they're waiting longer and paying more. And that's the truth. The loyalty hadn't faded, it had just shifted. Buyers were adapting in real time, and the marketplace was reshaping itself right under everyone's feet. And through it all, Japan was watching, adjusting, and planning. Because while the tariffs caused short-term pain, they also revealed long-term truths and set the stage for a bigger, smarter strategy in the years to come. Long-term strategic outlook. The dust hadn't even fully settled when Japanese automakers started thinking bigger. What happened in 2025 wasn't just a disruption, it was a lesson, a wake-up call. And from that wake-up call came one clear objective: build something that can't be broken by a single policy, a single tariff, or a single president's decision. Japanese companies began future-proofing their entire business structure. It wasn't about recovery anymore, it was about reinvention. First came resilience. Supply chains were no longer going to flow in a straight line from factory to dealership. They were redesigned like webs, interconnected, flexible, hard to break. Multiple countries handled production. Backup plans were built in, even raw material sourcing was diversified. One executive described it simply: "We want no more single points of failure." That mindset drove every move they made from then on. Then came global expansion. The US was still a major market, but it no longer stood alone. Japan looked toward Africa's growing middle class, to Latin America's steady demand, and to Europe's green revolution. They started introducing region-specific models, cars built for the narrow streets of Southeast Asia, EVs optimized for Europe's climate rules, pickup hybrids tailored for South American roads. The message was clear. They were no longer building cars just for America, they were building cars for the world. As one trade strategist put it, they understood what a lot of people still don't. The world doesn't stop when you raise tariffs, it just reroutes. That shift in thinking was powerful. Japan wasn't resisting change, they were mastering it. They didn't just bounce back, they built something stronger than before, something smarter, more nimble, and ready for whatever came next. And while Japan pressed forward with vision and discipline, the global trade world began to look at this whole episode differently, because beneath the surface of the auto market, a much deeper story had unfolded, one about power, policy, and the cost of short-term thinking. Lessons for global trade policies. From the outside, the 2025 tariffs looked like a headline-driven move, big, bold, and fast. But inside the halls of international trade, economists and policymakers were quietly dissecting what had really happened. And what they found was eye-opening. The decision that was meant to protect the U.S. auto industry had created a chain reaction that weakened allies, hurt consumers, and pushed innovation away from the U.S. instead of pulling it in. At the heart of it all was one truth. Protectionism sounds good in speeches, but it's messy in practice. The idea that a country can wall off its economy and come out stronger is tempting, but rarely works the way it's supposed to. In this case, the policy created more harm than help. The U.S. didn't gain new car factories. It didn't see a massive comeback of domestic brands. It saw prices go up, options go down, and trust fade. The episode showed just how interconnected today's world really is. Modern manufacturing doesn't live in one country. It flows across borders, across continents, tied together by trade deals and logistics chains. When one link is yanked out, the whole system shakes. But businesses that understand this don't panic. They pivot. Japan did exactly that, quietly, methodically, and with long-term strategy in mind. As one economic analyst reflected, this wasn't just a trade move gone sideways. This was a masterclass in what it means to play the long game in a short-sighted world. That lesson hit hard across boardrooms and ministries alike. Trade isn't about control, it's about cooperation. And if global powers forget that, they risk learning the hard way all over again. And in the heart of this storm stood the American auto industry, once the world leader, now facing the challenge of rebuilding trust, value, and vision. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. The road ahead for the U.S. auto industry. For U.S. automakers, the events of 2025 weren't just a tough year, they were a turning point. The empty lots, the rising prices, the loss of consumer confidence, they all pointed to one undeniable truth. Change was overdue. The industry could no longer rely on history or branding. It had to rebuild itself on the foundation of quality, innovation, and relevance. The road ahead wasn't about catching up. It was about starting fresh. First, the focus had to shift back to consumers. For years, buyers had been asking for efficiency, affordability, and green options. But the market didn't always deliver. Now, with Japanese and Korean brands setting the standard, U.S. companies had to step up. That meant reinvesting in small, fuel-efficient arms. That meant fixing quality issues. That meant designing cars people actually wanted, not just the ones that were easy to build. Second, the industry had to break free from old habits. EVs were on a trend. They were the future. And while some American brands had started to catch on, most were years behind Japan and even China. To compete globally, the U.S. had to go beyond electric badges and battery packs. It had to innovate in design, in software, in production speed. It had to make electric vehicles that didn't just exist, but led the market. Lastly, policymakers had a role to play. The 2025 tariffs showed just how fragile economic decisions can be. If U.S. automakers were to thrive, they needed smart, balanced policy, not political stunts. Trade deals had to encourage innovation, not scare it away. Tax structures had to reward progress, not protect stagnation. It wasn't about giving handouts, it was about building a real strategy. As one commentator summed it up, when you fight an engineer with a politician, the engineer builds around you. And that's exactly what happened. Japan built around the policy. Now it was America's turn to build forward, not just out of necessity, but out of ambition. And from this long, winding journey of policy mistakes, strategic pivots, and global consequences, emerged a final, undeniable truth that the future of global trade would belong to those who could adapt, cooperate, and plan beyond the next headline. A wake-up call for global industries. The 2025 U.S. auto tariff didn't just shift economies, it exposed a deeper reality about the world we live in today. One where borders are more symbolic than functional. One where success isn't measured by loud decisions, but by quiet strategy. And one where the biggest players aren't always the loudest. They're the ones willing to prepare, adjust, and adapt without fanfare. What happened to the Japanese auto industry wasn't just survival, it was transformation. They showed that even in a hostile environment, you can find an opportunity. That even when blocked, you can reroute. And that evolution often starts with silence, not shouting. The story wasn't about retaliation, it was about resilience. And in that quiet transformation lies a powerful lesson for every global industry. For world leaders, it's a call for more thoughtful policy. For corporations, it's a reminder to plan for uncertainty. And for consumers, it's proof that the cars we drive and the systems that build them are shaped by far more than just what happens on the factory floor. As one international trade expert concluded, this is not just about cars, it's about the future of global trade and the importance of strategic planning. That's the real story behind the tariff that missed its mark. It's a story of what happens when short-term thinking meets long-term resilience. And it's far from over. So what does this all really mean? The US thought it could force Japanese automakers into a corner with a single tariff. But Toyota, Honda, and Mazda didn't panic. They pivoted. They moved their factories. They rewired their supply chains. And they doubled down on the one thing America hadn't focused on fast enough: the future. They didn't just survive, they evolved. And while US companies clung to aging models and short-term wins, Japan was building EV fleets, solid-state batteries, and a global footprint that couldn't be blocked by any single country's policy. The result? American dealerships are now left with higher prices, fewer cars, and frustrated customers. This wasn't about revenge. This was about resilience. And in one sharp, quiet move, the balance of global auto power tipped, possibly for good. The question now isn't just how America responds, it's whether it can. Because while Washington was playing politics, Japan was playing chess. This isn't just a wake-up call, it's an alarm going off in the heart of Detroit. If US automakers don't change fast, the industry isn't just going to fall behind, it's going to be left behind. And the ones who pulled it off, they didn't say a word. They just walked away and rewrote the game.